In 1969, archaeologists excavating a cave in northern Iraq found something that changed how we understand ancient humans entirely. A Neanderthal had been buried there, but it wasn't the burial that stopped them. It was what was buried with him. Flowers. Specific flowers. Chosen deliberately. Placed with care around a body 60,000 years ago. And once you understand what that means, you will never think about grief the same way again. Because those flowers were not placed there by accident. They were not decoration. They were the first piece of evidence that something we think of as uniquely modern. The impulse to mark a death with meaning, to say this person mattered, to do something with the unbearable weight of loss, is not modern at all. It is as old as we are. And what your ancestors did with that impulse, the specific things they built around death and grief and the body that stopped existing, is one of the most important stories about being human that almost nobody has ever been told. Let's start with what they actually found. The site is called Shanidar Cave, located in the Zagros Mountains of northern Iraq. Beginning in the 1950s, archaeologist Ralph Solecki led excavations there and uncovered the remains of at least 10 Neanderthal individuals, buried across tens of thousands of years. One burial in particular, labeled Shanidar 4, would become one of the most debated discoveries in all of paleoanthropology. When scientists analyzed the soil surrounding the remains, they found dense clusters of pollen from at least 8 different plant species. Not scattered pollen, clustered pollen. The kind of concentration that only happens when actual flowers, whole flowers, are placed deliberately in one location. The species identified included yarrow, groundsel, grape hyacinth, and joint pine, among others. Several of these plants had documented medicinal properties known to later human cultures. Solecki's interpretation was that someone, 60,000 years ago, had gathered specific plants, carried them into a cave, and placed them around a body they were saying goodbye to. For decades, this finding was disputed. Some scientists argued the pollen clusters could have been carried in by burrowing rodents, or deposited by wind patterns inside the cave. But here is what the skeptics couldn't explain away. The flowers were not random. If the pollen had arrived by accident, you would expect to find a representative sample of whatever happened to be growing nearby. Instead, the plant species identified were selective, clustered, and in some cases not native to the immediate area around the cave. Someone chose them. And that choice is the thing that matters. Because choosing requires intention. And intention, when directed at a dead body, means something profound about what these ancient humans believed, or at least felt, about the people they had lost. They did not simply walk away from their dead, they stopped. They marked, they cared. But the flowers are only the beginning, because across the entire archaeological record, from every continent where ancient humans lived, the same story keeps emerging in different forms. Ancient humans treated their dead as if death was not the end of the relationship. In southern Africa, at a site called Border Cave, researchers found the remains of an infant buried with a shell ornament, roughly 74,000 years old. The shell had been deliberately perforated. It had been worn, probably as a bead, before being placed with the child. Someone took something they valued, something they wore on their own body, and buried it with a baby. In northern Spain, at a site called Atapuerca, researchers found a pit filled with the remains of at least 28 individuals, dated to roughly 430,000 years ago. Among the remains was a single hand axe, made of a distinctive red quartzite not found locally. It had never been used. It had been carried to the site specifically to be deposited with the dead. Someone made something beautiful, carried it a long distance, and gave it to people who could no longer hold it. In Russia, at a site called Sunghir, dated to roughly 34,000 years ago, researchers found 2 children buried together, head to head, covered from head to foot in thousands of tiny ivory beads. To make those beads, someone would have had to spend an estimated 10,000 hours carving mammoth ivory into tiny identical shapes. 10,000 hours. For 2 children who were already gone. That is not practicality, that is love expressed through the only language available. And what all of these findings share is something that modern archaeology has taken decades to fully articulate. Ancient humans did not just dispose of their dead, they grieved them. Specifically, actively, collectively, and with an investment of time and effort and material that makes no practical sense unless you understand that grief for our ancestors was not a private inconvenience to be managed quickly. It was a communal obligation, a shared experience that the entire group participated in together. Now let's talk about what that actually looked like, because the archaeological record can tell us what objects were left behind. But to understand what the experience of grief looked like for a living human community 50,000 years ago, we have to look at something else entirely. We have to look at the people who still live something close to that life today. Anthropologists studying hunter-gatherer societies across Africa, Australia, and the Amazon have documented grief practices that, while varying in their specific forms, share a set of core features that appear almost universally. The first is that grief was never private. When someone died in a small hunter-gatherer band, the entire community, every person in the group of 25 to 150, knew about it immediately. There was no delay, no softening, no carefully worded message sent through an intermediary. The loss was immediate and collective, because the community itself was small enough that losing one person changed the texture of every single day for everyone who remained. If a skilled hunter died, the group's survival calculus shifted. If a grandmother died, the children she had been feeding and teaching lost their teacher. If a young mother died, her infant needed someone else to nurse it. Death in a small band was never an individual event. It was a community event, and grief was treated accordingly. The second universal feature was that grief was expressed loudly, physically, and without restraint. Anthropologists studying indigenous Australian groups have documented grief practices involving loud collective wailing that could continue for days, not quiet weeping. Sustained, communal, vocal grief performed by the whole group in the open, together. Among the Andaman Islanders, a hunter-gatherer group studied extensively in the early 20th century. Grief involved ritualized crying between individuals, a formalized practice of sitting together and weeping with each other, not just near each other. The Kung San people of the Kalahari practiced extended mourning periods during which normal work activities were suspended. The community stopped, not as a ceremony, as a recognition that what had happened was large enough to require stopping. Anthropologist Colin Turnbull, who lived with the Mbuti people of the Congo forest for years, documented grief practices so physically expressive and communally total that they were almost incomprehensible to his Western academic training. He wrote that the Mbuti treated grief not as something to be overcome, but as something to be experienced completely, with everyone, until it was genuinely finished. The third feature, and perhaps the most important, is that death was not followed by a return to normal. In many hunter-gatherer societies, the name of the deceased was not spoken for a period of time after death. Their possessions were either burned, buried with them, or redistributed. The physical space they occupied in camp was restructured. Some groups moved their entire camp after a death, refusing to sleep in the same place where someone had died. These were not superstitions. They were sophisticated psychological tools for forcing the community to acknowledge that the world had genuinely changed, that things were not going to go back to the way they were, that a real absence now existed where a real person used to be. In many Western cultures, the pressure moves in the opposite direction almost immediately. Within days of a death, there is an implicit expectation that the bereaved should begin returning to function, going back to work, answering messages, resuming the shape of ordinary life. And what the anthropological record makes clear is that this pressure, this insistence on quick return to normal, is one of the most historically unusual responses to death ever documented in any human culture. Almost everywhere humans have lived, for almost all of human history, the community made space for grief that was long enough to actually be grief. Not a service, not a reception, not a week of leave. A genuine, extended collective reorganization around the fact that someone was gone. Now, here's where it gets more complicated and more interesting, because grief, it turns out, is not just an emotional experience. It is a neurological one. Neuroscientist Mary Frances O'Connor, whose research at the University of Arizona has spent years mapping what grief actually does to the brain, found something that reframes almost everything we think we know about loss. When you lose someone you love, your brain doesn't immediately update its model of the world to reflect that they're gone. It keeps expecting them. O'Connor's research using brain imaging found that the neural circuits associated with reward and motivation remain activated when bereaved people think about the person they've lost. The brain is still searching, still anticipating, still at some level expecting the person to come back. She describes this as the brain's model of the world being out of sync with reality. Your mind knows the person is gone, but your nervous system hasn't fully updated yet. And this is not a malfunction. This is, O'Connor argues, the same learning mechanism that allows you to form attachments in the first place. You become close to someone because your brain builds a detailed model of them, their presence, their patterns, their role in your life. When they die, that model doesn't automatically delete. It has to be updated through repeated experience of the absence. Every time you reach for your phone to call them and remember. Every time you almost tell them something and stop. Every time you walk into a room and notice they're not there. That is your brain updating its model. And that process, according to O'Connor's research, cannot be rushed. It takes as long as it takes because it is a genuine neurological learning process, not an emotional indulgence. And here is the part that directly connects to what your ancestors understood without ever having a neuroscience lab. The practices that appear most consistently across ancient and traditional grief cultures, the communal wailing, the extended mourning periods, the physical restructuring of space, the explicit acknowledgement that things are not going back to normal, are almost perfectly aligned with what O'Connor's research suggests the grieving brain actually needs. It needs repeated, explicit, supported experiences of the absence. It needs a community that doesn't rush it back to a model of the world that no longer exists. It needs time and presence, and the permission to be publicly, visibly, undeniably in grief. Your ancestors gave each other all of those things as a matter of course. Not because they had read the neuroscience, but because they had lived with enough grief, close enough together for long enough, to understand intuitively what the experience required. And what we have built over the last several centuries of industrialized, privatized, efficiency-oriented modern life is a culture that systematically removes almost every one of those things. We moved death out of the home and into hospitals and funeral homes. We moved grief out of the community and into the therapist's office. We gave it a timeline. We gave it a diagnosis when it didn't meet the timeline. We told people to be strong. We sent them back to work. And then we wondered why so many people, years after a loss, still feel something unfinished sitting inside them. Something that never quite resolved. Something that the 2-hour service and the casseroles and the sympathy cards and the week of leave never quite reached. That unfinished feeling has a name in the clinical literature. It is called prolonged grief disorder, and it affects roughly 10% of bereaved people. But what O'Connor and others in this field are increasingly arguing is that the question may not be why some people develop prolonged grief. The question may be why we built a culture that treats the natural requirements of grief as pathological in the first place. Your ancestors buried their dead with flowers they carried from a distance. They spent 10,000 hours carving ivory beads for children who could no longer see them. They wailed together for days. They moved their camps. They stopped saying names. They gave their grief the weight it deserved, not because they were more sentimental than you, because they understood something about loss that we have spent several centuries very efficiently forgetting. That grief is not a problem to be solved. It is a process to be witnessed by yourself, by your people, for as long as it honestly takes. The flowers in Shanidar Cave have been there for 60,000 years. They were placed by someone who had no word for grief counselor, no concept of stages of mourning, no culture telling them to be strong. They just knew that the person was gone, and that the only honest response to that was to stop and mark it and make sure the person knew somehow that they had mattered. We still know how to do that. We've just been taught to do it faster.